Okay, so let's review capitalism, also known as private enterprise or free market economies. Capitalism is a very individualist ideology that believes the government should have limited control over the economy, laissez-faire, because the invisible hand is going to figure everything out. Now, if these terms seem unfamiliar, go back and watch the previous video. Capitalism's great because it encourages competition because people have to take care of themselves. Look at the amazing economic growth during the Industrial Revolution. That was due to capitalist competition. A middle class grew out at this time because entrepreneurs were able to pull themselves out of the lower classes. The very wealthy middle class were known as the nouveau riche. They couldn't be called upper class because that's the nobility. One of the most capitalist nations in the world is Singapore, and the richest nation in the world, the United States, is also fairly capitalist. Both of these countries celebrate the success that's come from private enterprise. Even compare the technological advances we enjoy from competition compared to government-controlled nations like North Korea, where the standard of living is very low. But it's not all roses with capitalism. There is a serious downside to laissez-faire economics. Those classical liberal ideas of individual responsibility don't necessarily take into account how all of those freedoms are going to impact the people who don't have the advantages of the middle class. Again, let's look at the Industrial Revolution. While the growing middle class was benefiting from all that new industry, the workers in those industries were terribly mistreated. Even today, we have sweatshops where workers have limited rights and are abused just so that those of us in the middle class can have the latest electronics or clothing for lower prices. Our Canadian corporations go to countries where it is more laissez-faire so that the businesses can keep more of their profits by paying the workers less than they would have to here in Canada. Another problem with the free market economy is it's unstable. Without the government having some controls over the economy, there could be huge swings in the business cycle. The business cycle occurs in a capitalist economy because demand flows up and down. But consumer demand for products doesn't always reflect what's most important or even logical. For example, the tulip mania in the Netherlands in 1637, where people paid huge prices for these new flowers called tulips. And they were paying in the fall because they were predicting that they'd be so valuable in the spring. In fact, one guy even sold his house for just a handful of bulbs. But then the bubble burst and suddenly the value of tulips dropped and people were left with almost worthless bulbs and there was no government unemployment insurance to protect them. In our time, in the mid-90s, Tickle Me Elmo dolls came out and people were paying hundreds of dollars actually fighting in the aisles to get a doll. But once Christmas came and went, no one cared anymore and the store shelves were filled with dolls that nobody wanted. And while capitalists are supposed to use their resources efficiently in order to maximize profits, in reality there's times when wasting resources can actually be seen as the best way to make a profit. Have you heard how the shark fins are harvested by merely cutting the fin off and then throwing the shark back in the water because they don't want to pay to store the whole shark, even though money can be made from the meat and the skin? That fin is so valuable the harvester doesn't care about wasting resources. In Canada, until the government intervened, many logging companies would clear-cut a forest because it was cheaper to damage the land. In the pursuit of self-interest, problems like pollution and corruption become more common. Those who can't afford an education are left behind to work and make money for the family. During the Industrial Revolution, slums grew, and the working poor lived in horrible conditions. But is this an injustice, or just a natural law of economics? Those who saw it as an injustice started to develop a new ideology, socialism. This ideology focuses more on the people or society than individual profits, more on the need to cooperate instead of compete. They liked the liberal ideas of freedom and individual worth, but they saw that you couldn't be free or compete when someone is taking advantage of you. Socialists saw the need for government involvement in the economy to bring an end to these injustices. Now remember, like any ideology, there's going to be a spectrum or a degree to which the government should intervene. Utopian socialists believe that some government intervention would create a more perfect society. They don't want full government control as communists would argue for, but instead intervention in areas like labor laws, education, social programs. These ideas are very similar to the modern liberal ideas of today. For example, in the past there were no laws regulating the protection of employees working with dangerous goods like radium. Today, there is government intervention to protect those workers. John Stuart Mill was an enlightened philosopher who agreed with Adam Smith for the need to have competition and self-reliance, but Mill also argued there needs to be some government intervention for the protection of the workers. For example, child labor laws or minimum wage. A very right-wing classical liberal would be opposed to this because it reduces the owner's ability to make a profit. But someone who's more middle of the spectrum would argue that while competition is important, making sure everyone has a chance to compete is just as important. The most famous utopian socialist would probably be Robert Owen, a capitalist factory owner in New Lanark. He sacrificed some of his own profits in order to create a community where children didn't work, they went to school, and workers were treated with respect. He argued that if your employees are happy, they're going to work harder, which increases your profits. It's a philosophy Google supports. Their headquarters, or Googleplex, includes rec facilities, game rooms, and walking paths. By sacrificing some of their profits to make their employees happy, this private institution prospers. Socialists point to the ideas of Robert Owen to argue for the need of government to provide those benefits to everyone. Unions are a socialist idea. They're a way for employees to work collectively to improve their standard of living. In a union, members must collectively support each other and will use tactics like going on strike to get some leverage over the employer. Before the 30s, it was common for workers to be fired if they tried to start a union, because the boss knew it would take away some of his powers. Business owners could even depend on the police to break up a peaceful strike for them, get the workers back to work. But today's are laws to protect individuals looking to start a union. These laws are another example of government intervention taking away some of the freedoms that exist within capitalism. Sweden is often referred to as a democratic socialist state. It's very similar to Canada's economy, but it has more social programs. The term cradle to grave describes the level of government programs they have for their citizens. While Swedish companies are able to make a profit for individuals, there's also a very collectivist attitude that supports high taxes in exchange for the government supplying basic needs like healthcare. There's also a high level of support for unions. This is due in part to Sweden's policy of indicative planning. That's where the government, business owners, and workers' unions get together to discuss what they want for the economy. Where is it going to go in the next 5 years? They indicate what is needed from everyone to ensure economic success. It's much more cooperative than competitive. This level of support for intervention puts Sweden on the center left of the economic spectrum. So, how to answer the 3 economic questions according to democratic socialists? Well, what are you going to produce? That's consumer demand, but the government will also determine what goods citizens need. How are you going to produce them? Well, companies are going to compete, but the government will intervene and help if necessary. And who should the goods and services be distributed to? Well, the government's going to ensure economic equality by making sure everyone has access to the basic goods and services. But then there's also going to be goods and services produced for those who can afford them.